Hi, welcome back. My name is Brittany, and today's video is my July wrap-up. I got through 8 books this month, and I actually did an even split again for audio, for physical, so let's just jump right in to all the books I read in July. The first book I read was Swordheart by T. Kingfisher, and this is narrated by Jesse Valinsky, and this is a fantasy romance following Howl. She is 36 years old, and after her late husband passed away, she decided to still stay with his family and live in their home and kind of help out and caretake. But when his uncle or great uncle passes away, he leaves his entire estate, belongings, everything to Howl. This makes the blood relatives of the uncle very unhappy because they wanted the money. These family members are very similar to Cinderella's evil, wicked stepmother. They're not happy about this situation, so they decide to lock Howl up in her bedroom until she agrees to marry cousin Alver, because if she marries him, then that will keep the money in the family, and then they'll essentially just turn her into like a broodmare for continuing on their line. This book is really funny, and I just loved the world we're in. It was super interesting, super unique. It's hilarious. It's refreshing to have an older female main character. Howl herself is a normal 36-year-old woman. Like, she's not a secret assassin. She's not she doesn't have any martial art talents. She doesn't have any magical powers, no fae heritage. Like, she is a normal human woman, 36 years old, who's like, I don't want to marry this guy and I don't want kids. Like, gross. And she's just so funny and down to earth and wholesome. And it was just really refreshing because she's just different than the fantasy romance heroines I feel like I've read about a lot lately. Like I mentioned, Howl is locked in her room at the start of this book, and she's trying to figure a way out of this. And she finds a sword in her room. And as soon as she draws the sword, this guy, Sarkis, pops up ready to fight. And he is kind of mid-40-year-old guy who's been trapped in this sword. And once it's been drawn, he essentially is duty-bound to protect and serve the wielder. He rescues her and helps her get out of this house because it is quite dangerous. They don't really want to let her leave. And they go on a traveling journey to find the Church of the Rat and their legal experts to try to make sure her inheritance is taken care of. All of these things are done so she can basically leave this house kick the other people out of the house, keep it for herself, and keep the inheritance that was kind of rightly gifted to her, because these people keep trying to steal it from her and lock her in various rooms. So there's lots of scheming afoot. There are a lot of really cool side characters. I think Howl and Sarkis are really fun. Their banter is really good. They're just so cute and so silly together. The world itself is really fascinating. So this book is part of the Clockwork Boys or Clockwork War world, and I'm not familiar with it, but I didn't have to be. I was able to read the story and pick up on things, but nothing was spoiled or super confusing. This very much is a standalone book, but if anything, it intrigued me to check out that other Clockwork Boys series and the Paladin's Grace series that T. Kingfisher also has, because we get to hear about some of the Clockwork War, that history, but we also meet paladins on their traveling journey, and I just am so fascinated by this world she created. It's so fun, it's so unique, and just refreshing. It felt really cozy, but it felt realistic. I just loved how aged up our characters were. That was the biggest perk for me. And then just the humor. Like I mentioned, this book is so funny and snarky and witty. And I think a lot of the credit, obviously the author wrote a fantastic book, but if you do decide to pick this up, I highly recommend the audiobook because Jesse Valinsky's delivery, all of the voices she does are so good. They're so good. I just love them. Howl and Sarkis specifically, she makes Sarkis sound kind of like Jamie Fraser from Outlander. And he's just grumbly and grumpy. And it is a little bit of Grumpy Sunshine, but it worked. It was really well done. She even voices the extra characters and creatures that we meet. Just all of it. I just really enjoyed it. So if this sounds interesting, I highly recommend. I had so much fun cackling and listening to this book, and it really just started my month off great. The next book I finished in July was The Empire of Silence. This is the first book in the Sun Eater series by Christopher Rucchio, narrated by Samuel Roukin. This book follows Hadrian. He is our main character and our main point of view for this book in the entirety of the series. And Hadrian is I mean, he's human, but he has been genetically modified. So, like, his family line is very powerful. Him and his entire family's lineage, they all have certain features that, like, marks them as that family. So they all have, like, dark black hair, certain facial features, violet eyes. So, like, other families know who these people are and that they're from a very powerful house. I mean, this has been planned from conception, and these kind of space humanoid beings, like, they look human, but they don't, like, reproduce in the same way. So, like, every aspect of Hadrian's life was chosen from conception. And in the past, every firstborn son rises up and becomes a new ruler of the land. And that is kind of where Hadrian has been, like, one track, you know, to be the next leader. This is a sci-fi world, so we do bounce planets a lot. There's a lot of political maneuverings. It's kind of a long haul as far as learning the world, learning the characters, the different species we meet. There's a lot of space travel. There's some pretty cool space fights, and there are definitely some aliens as well. Hadrian doesn't necessarily want to be the leader, but he also doesn't want his younger brother Crispin to be leader either. Hadrian is 20 years by Earth standard, and Crispin is about 16, and they just have different personalities, different approaches to things, different political preferences, and so Hadrian is in this really complicated spot of, like, not wanting this role, but also not wanting someone else to do it in a way he doesn't agree with. Hadrian, unfortunately, finds himself kind of on, like, the outside of his father's meetings and decisions, and Crispin is slowly being brought in on the inside to all these things, and this just kind of leads to, like, drama thing after drama thing, where ultimately Hadrian is pretty much put in a position where he is exiled. His father's like, I want you to go to this other planet and join the Chantry, or, like, their religious combat order. And this is, like, the last thing he wants to do. He does not want to join the Chantry. He actually really wants to be a scholar. So on his way to the Chantry, a different plot is developed so he can actually try to escape to a scholar planet. But literally everything goes wrong for this guy. So poor Hadrian wakes up on a completely different planet than he was expecting to be. Like, his ship was stolen, his crew's gone, he has no belongings, he's poor, and if he, you know, tells people who his family is, then he's just going to get hauled right back to his father and essentially punished. So all of this just kind of leads us to this low point for Hadrian, and he has to survive, and ultimately that gets him involved in a new world's political structure and the alien race, which is called the Cielsen. It is such an interesting world. I mentioned this takes place in space. It is a sci-fi, but it also has a lot of Roman inspiration as well, and I'm really enjoying this combination of space and Roman inspiration. Red Rising does this, which I absolutely love Red Rising, and there's also some of this in The Will of the Many by James Islington, where we have this Roman and Greek inspiration, and it just makes things feel really elevated and regal. There's verbal sparring, like how you communicate is really important. Appearance, I mean, some of those courtly politics that we find in European fantasy stories are similar, but it almost feels just more elevated and epic, especially when this is occurring in space. So I've really enjoyed that. I like Hadrian as a main character. I liked Christopher Ruccio's writing. Like I said, this is kind of a long haul. There's a lot to set up. There's a lot to learn, but I have heard so many good things about this series. So I am really excited to keep going. And if this sounds interesting, at least as of like August 2024, this is included in Audible Plus's catalog. So if you already get an Audible credit every month, check out their catalog because quite a few of the books in this series are on there. So I'm hoping to keep trucking along and take advantage of it while I can. The next book I finished was Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez, and this is book 2 in the Part of Your World series, where we have crossovers from a few characters we met in the first book, and I think these crossovers will continue for her third book in this world. This book follows Dr. Brianna Ortiz, and she's an ER physician, and she is hoping to get like the new director job. I can't remember exactly what the job title was, but she's hoping to step up in her career at her emergency department. Enter Dr. Jacob Maddox, who is new to the emergency room. Brianna and Jacob have a really rough run-in, a bad first impression, and then she is told that the decision for this new ER position is going to be put on hold so the department can give Dr. Jacob a chance. And so she has this bad run-in, her position is kind of delayed, and so she's like under the impression that this like new butthead doctor is like going to take her job, that she's been like training for and just like hoping for this whole time. And he just kind of like swoops in and she's like, what the heck? She's not happy. She's also struggling because her brother needs a kidney transplant, and she just basically is watching him kind of decline mentally and physically as a result of this because they have not had a match yet. Dr. Jacob ends up becoming the match, and through a series of letters, they reconnect and a romance follows from there. This book was fun. It was a quick, easy read. Like, I think I read it in a day. Like, it was entertaining, and that's kind of all I can really say. I think for me, it's hard to read about medical people because all I kept doing as I'm reading this book is picturing my own emergency department where I work and picturing the flow of things. And like some of it just wasn't realistic for me because I work in the field, and I'm like, okay, like maybe there are these beautiful emergency departments where doctors can actually leave the floor for lunch, but where I work, like you go get food and you come back and you're eating in between patients. Like you're not actually getting a lunch break to leave the floor and write letters in a supply closet. Like it just wasn't realistic for me. And then like the kidney donation stuff I actually found was really interesting that we learn about that from like the back of the book, you know, the book synopsis. But like some of that process too, which is kind of interesting for me because it was informally done. Like Jacob knows the nephrologist who like does tests on the side. And I'm like, well, like that's like slightly unethical too. Like, and like a conflict of interest. I don't know. So those were a few things that I thought were strange. One thing I really did like is Jacob struggles with a lot of anxiety, which you would think working in ER and anxiety don't really go together, but it is actually comforting to like know what to do in emergencies because I also have quite a bit of anxiety. So I liked that representation and discussion on like anxious thoughts and how like a simple text message or an interaction can really just like fester and become something worse than it truly is. Like when you have anxiety, you just ruminate on these things and they become so awful when it's really not. And especially from a male perspective, I did enjoy how that was explored. There were a few times where Brianna was really in tune with his anxiety and like checking in with him. They were communicating really well. And then there was other times that she wasn't. And then it led to some really weird miscommunication. And then their like initial hookup scene I thought was really odd. Because I'm like, oh my gosh, what is going on? Just like talk about it because you guys had been talking really well this entire time. Like, what is happening? There's a few things like that, but overall it was fun. It was fine. I think some of those like slightly specific critiques are just going to be like specific to me because I work in an ER. But I'm curious if I have other healthcare friends watching, like, are you like that too? Because I know when I watch healthcare shows, I'm also super annoying because I'm like, that's not how that would go. Like, that's not the right monitor. Like, oh, hey, that's our IV pump. Like, I can't help but like point those things out. So I was kind of doing that with the book. So I think I will check out the third book in this series. I believe it's called Just for the Summer. And if I'm still struggling with like the healthcare thing, maybe it's just not for me. And that's fine. But if you are looking for a quick summer romance, like overall, despite my little critiques here and there, I thought it was a good time and worth a checkout. The next book I finished was My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh, and this is narrated by Julia Whelan. This follows, I believe, an unnamed main character. I'm trying to think back, and I don't think we ever get her name, but we follow a young woman in her early 20s, and she essentially wants to sleep for an entire year. She is hopeful and thinking that if she can just sleep for a year, she will wake up and be this new, rejuvenated, completely different person than who she currently is. She does have the finances available to not work for an entire year. I think her parents were wealthy and she gets some money from them. Like she has bills on auto pay. So she sets up a lot of things in order to essentially check out of life. She's not suicidal, but she is very much, I would say, depressed and just honestly checked out. She does find a psychiatrist, and I would say a horrible psychiatrist who should not have their license to prescribe medications in order to help sedate her enough so she can achieve this goal of sleeping for an entire year. As this is going on, she is drinking, like eating poorly, not taking care of her home, and still maintaining a toxic sexual relationship with a guy and a toxic relationship with her best friend. This book was interesting for me, and one thing I did like is it has Ottessa Moshfegh's just like nasty, uncomfortable writing that I really loved from Lapvana. Like, she's not afraid to shy away from just kind of like gross, uncomfortable descriptions of things. But this book was just honestly really unsatisfying for me. When I picked this up, I thought the story would go one way and one way only. And when it didn't, it just felt disappointing. I didn't feel like our character got the arc she really needed. Ugh. And I hope this doesn't come across the wrong way at all. I know mental health is so challenging at times. There's so many things out of our control. Like if you have mental diagnoses, like, you know, there's just some things we can't fight. But I do think, at least like my personal opinion, is we have to try to help ourselves, and like sleeping away an entire year is not the answer. And like it also stressed me out because she took so many drugs. She took so many drugs, so many different antipsychotics, benzos, like sleep aids, all at the same time. Like she really had a drug addiction, I would say. And it was so dangerous, the way she starts and stops things, the way she takes too much, like all of that just honestly stressed me out. And I didn't like her arc because it didn't feel like we really got anything out of this experience. And I'm wondering if that's maybe the point of the book. Like, I would really just love to pick the author's brain on this one. What were you trying to achieve with your story? Like, what was your angle? What were you trying to write? Because I don't know. It was just an interesting read. It was slightly frustrating. Our main character is rude and mean, and like, it was just a frustrating read. And then you get to the end and I just was like, what? Like, I don't know. And it was also strange, I will say, to have Julia Whelan read something so kind of like nasty and depraved. Because normally she reads like historical fiction or contemporary romance. And so to have her read some of these things, it just was so different to hear. Like, her tone was just so different, but she still did a great job. It just was odd. It is definitely along the lines of weird girl fiction. It is not a self-help book by any means, which I initially thought it was when it came out in like 2020. I'm like, oh, my year of rest and relaxation. Like, I'm going to learn how to rest. No, that's not what this is. But if it sounds interesting, definitely check it out. I don't know. I would still say it was a good book. Like, it was an average 3-star for me. If you're already interested in this kind of stuff for Otessa Moshfegh anyways, definitely check it out. But it just was really unsatisfying. The next book I finished was Howl's Moving Castle, and this is by Diana Wynne Jones. This follows Sophie, who is the oldest of 3 sisters, and she unfortunately catches the attention of the Witch of the Waste. She is cursed and turned into an old woman. She's not happy about this, so she takes her like granny little self across the lands in search of Wizard Howl and his moving castle in hopes that he can break her curse. She ends up working for him because, of course, like most curses, you can't talk about it, as she tries to break her own curse, help Howl with one of his own, and eventually meet the Witch of the Waste again. If you are interested in this story at all, you should read the book first, because this is also a movie made by Studio Ghibli. I am a Studio Ghibli like diehard fan. I love their entire franchise of movies, especially this one. And this was the second Studio Ghibli movie I watched at probably like 12 years old, and I've seen it so many times since. And once you know the movie and the voice actors, it was really hard for me to do my own world building because I just kept picturing the gorgeous animation that Studio Ghibli does and is kind of known for. So I would recommend that if you're interested. But honestly, like, the movie ran superior. Like, the book was fine, but the movie is just so much better in my opinion. And the internet is kind of divided. I looked up some Goodreads reviews. I mean, it just felt like I found equal parts, team book and equal parts team movies. For me, the book was fine. It is definitely young adult, if not even middle grade reading level. And at times it felt really easy. Like, it did feel like I was reading a middle grade book. But then there was other times where I was really confused by the writing and the plot. And then I tried to go back through to find parts that confused me, and I'm like, I don't know, I just really can't even verbalize why it was confusing, but I did struggle with this book a little bit. There are a few major changes from the book to the movie as well. So one of Sophie's sister has a really big, complicated, convoluted plot line in here. And in the movie, it is kind of streamlined and simplified quite a bit. Also, there is a war that's mentioned in the book, And Howl's character himself feels different. He is way more of a womanizer in the book, just kind of like escaping off to make women fall in love with him. And then when they do, he like pulls away. That's like a game he does in the book, and that felt very strange. But in the movie, the war is a huge part and he's actively engaged in it. That is because the screenwriter and director Miyazaki was very against the Iranian war when he wrote the movie, and it came out in 2006 or 2007. And so there's a lot of anti-war propaganda themes in the movie where it's a much smaller part of the book. Overall, the book was fine. Like I said, I just really love the movie so much more. And I know that's like a hot take for bookish people. It's not just myself, but the movie wins for me personally. It's definitely a nostalgic thing for a lot of people, especially if you picked this book up, years ago, or it's just been part of your childhood. The movie is part of my childhood, so I think that's why I'm definitely partial to the movie. But it was still an interesting read anyways, to see kind of like where source material came from. I don't know. If anything, it just made me want to watch the movie, so maybe I'll have another Howl's Moving Castle movie moment. The next book I finished was Looking Glass Sound by Catriona Ward, and this follows Wilder Harlow as he visits a little cottage on the Maine coast with his family. Something happens when he is on his family vacation, and that really affects him and his friends as they grow up and into adulthood, and we get to see what that event was and how it transpires. That is kind of all I will leave you with. I thought this was a great summer read because he is summering in Maine. That is his vacation, so you do get some really nice coastal descriptions. This was an interesting book though, because I was nowhere close guessing exactly what would happen. I would say Catriona Ward has tricked me again. And her stories are just so interesting. If you pick this up, I think it's worth your time, but I would really recommend the physical copy because there are writing choices done with the actual setup of the book, like font choices. You do have some time jumps back and forth. You have the physical copy, you're able to flip around to make those connections. And I don't know if you would have that same impact with an audiobook read. I only read this physically, but I do feel like this was a good choice. Yeah, it was kind of wild. There is, if you are sensitive to stuff happening to kids, there is a little bit of a creepy moment where some things happen to kids, but it is very brief. But it was a little unsettling to read about, not gonna lie. A little creepy, but thankfully it wasn't too scary. So definitely a good twisty thriller. Honestly, it was just enjoyable to go for this ride and to see what the heck is happening. So yeah, Looking Glass Sound by Catriona Ward. I'm excited to just keep checking out her books. So if you have another one that you have enjoyed, let me know down below. The next book I finished was Poor Dear by Claire Oshetsky, and this follows Margaret and the horrific event that happens to her best friend Agnes when they are young girls. What happens to her friend is incredibly tragic and incredibly sad. Like, it is 100% an accident, but it's so heartbreaking, and it was very hard to read about. It was very sad. Try not to think about it too much. But it was like not only sad and just like heartbreaking. It was so fucked up, honestly, because it's one of those things where you can almost picture happening in real life. Margaret is part of this really tragic, awful thing, and her friend Agnes dies. Really, the book is exploring grief, loss, and trauma, and like how does a young child process this and how does it affect their lives. And I would also argue this book is exploring how parents react to something like this as well and how they treat their children. What happens in this book is so hard, and I'm not sure how I would handle this, but I feel like Margaret's mother definitely had some moments where she could have made different choices that might have set Margaret up for better success in the future. Margaret has not processed this trauma well into her young adulthood. This thing has followed her throughout her life, and she starts to see a deer in a bathrobe. And that does make sense, but that is how her grief and trauma is being experienced by her, and how she is moving through this and trying to tell us her story. I really enjoyed this book, as hard as it was to read. I thought Claire's writing was beautiful. I thought her storytelling, like, there is a certain way this story is told, and I thought that was really well done. I liked how, like, trauma was also animalized in the form of a deer, and how Margaret starts to see this. Yeah, I just liked a lot of things about this book, and I'm excited to check out her other novel, Chouette, where a mom gives birth to a baby bird. So excited to see how she kind of takes this spin on animals in that one as well. This book does end hopeful, and we do leave Margaret in a better place. If it sounds interesting, I highly, highly recommend this book. The last book I finished was The Girls by Emma Cline, and this is narrated by Cady McClain. This book is very much inspired and loosely based on, according to Wikipedia, the Manson family and the murder of Sharon Tate, because that also occurred in the 1960s. Russell and Charles Manson do have some similarities in that they've recruited mostly young girls. They used drugs, hallucinogenics, LSD, things like that to get these girls to do what he wants. He has very radicalized thoughts and opinions about things. He is trying to become a musician and obtain a record deal. So this book follows Evie Boyd in the 1960s. And she is 14 years old, and she essentially sees this group of girls in town that kind of catch her eye, and then she is intrigued and curious and brought into their cult. It is led by this man named Russell, and kind of the primary girl who brings in Evie, her name is Suzanne. This book was hard to listen to because there are really graphic scenes and parts describing some of the physical and sexual assault that happens to these girls. And it's just so awful to like listen to that, but also like be listening and you're like, no, don't do it. Like, don't go there. You're like, it's so terrible. Evie comes from a normal middle-class family. Like, her parents are divorced. Her mom starts dating again. She has a best friend, but like all of these relationships turn really tumultuous once she gets brought into this group of people. She thinks it's really cool. And I mean, you just see like the peer pressure and like how brainwashed everyone is, and how easily the young brain is just like brought into this. Like, it was hard to read because you're like, oh my gosh, like you as the reader, and especially as an adult, like I remember feeling very like confident and sure of myself, and like I knew a lot when I was younger, and I know you hear adults say that all the time, but you get to watch her get sucked into these situations. And one thing I really liked is how Emma Cline wrote the scenes where Evie is in the middle of a situation where she knows this is wrong, like, or she knows something's not right, like it doesn't feel good, but how easily she is just brought into this and how she rationalizes these things to be cool, to fit in. And it's just so sad. Not everyone gets sucked into a cult, but even just doing things you don't agree with or align with based on peer pressure from others, like that part was so relatable as a teenager, and like, it just was really hard to read about. Despite the darker content and just how hard it was to read, I thought it was really well written. It is kind of a then and now story of Evie as an adult reflecting back on everything, and her time with Russell and the girls does lead up to some murders. It was definitely like a dark end to a couple darker books, but I overall really did enjoy it. I do want to check out Emma Cline's backlist, so if you've read anything else by her, I would love your recommendation, so let me know down below. That is it, you guys. Thank you so much for hanging out with me and hearing all about my July books. It definitely was an interesting month. Like, we were up, we were down, we were up, and then we were down because things got really dark, but overall, I read some really good stuff I'm happy about. I hope you have an excellent reading month. What was your favorite book in July? Let me know down below, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!